Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Richard McCabe here, I want to welcome you to the second of this term's lecture sponsored by the Friends of the Bodleian. I'm delighted that so many of you can be with us this afternoon, albeit online. We, of course, look forward to a return to normality, but one of the benefits of using online resources is that more people can participate. So we hope in due course, when things do return to normal, that we'll be able to sponsor the events in both modes, both in person and online. Now, the subject of today's lecture, Jewish Treasures in Oxford, is particularly apposite because despite the circumstances, the work of supporting the library has to go on. And Hebrew and Judaic culture is currently a top priority for Bodleian fundraising. And we hope to be able to announce many exciting developments in relation to that in the coming months and years. Now, today's speaker is uniquely qualified to address all the issues involved because Cesar Merchant-Hammond is Hebrew and Judaic curator here at the Bodleian Library and also the director of the Leopold Müller Memorial Library at Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Cesar studied at the University of the Andes in Bogota, where he obtained a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics, and then took an MA and PhD in Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College London. He was formerly librarian at Leo Baeck College in London, where he taught Jewish history, before becoming deputy librarian at the Leopold Müller Memorial Library. He has published articles on German Jewish history, on Yiddish, on medieval translations from the Arabic into Hebrew, and on Hebrew book and manuscript collections. Most recently, he has co-edited with Rebecca Adams Jewish Treasures from Oxford Libraries, a volume which is beautifully produced, as they invariably are, by Bodleian Publishing, and as you've heard Richard Parfitt say, currently available to buy at a special 20% discount for those registered for this event. So without any more ado, I shall now pass you on to Cesar so we can listen to what he has to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. I go on to say my piece, that the Bodleian Library and the Oxford colleges hold one of the greatest collections of Judaica manuscripts and printed books in the world is an undisputed truth. How this came to happen is less well known, and what our volume intends to do is to open a window into the world of collectors and collections of Judaica manuscripts, as Martin Gross puts it. And it is fitting, I quote him first, for it is thanks to his generosity that this volume has become a reality. I thank Marty. I also thank my tireless co-editor, Rebecca Abrams, without whom the book would be a much lesser volume, and the authors of the chapters who made their deep knowledge available to all. The wonderful team at Bodleian Publishing who made a superb job and turned our fantasies into a jewel of a book. Borges said, "I always thought paradise would be some kind of library." Furthermore, as my predecessor Piet van Boxel put it, the Judaica collection is itself a library of libraries. So what I'm going to do today is to take you on a lightning speed tour of a section of paradise. We decided for our volume from the start to focus on collections and not on individual volumes, because this seemed to us the best way to draw attention to the makeup of this wonderful treasure. We wanted to understand how this treasure of Jewish civilization ended up at Oxford. This is what I could try to do today, but it is impossible in the short span of time available. So I will do what we did not do, that is to look at the collections one by one and highlight some of the best items in it. Now, it all started with Thomas Bodley and his vision of a library which held books in the three classical languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. As a general rule, in his time, lip service was paid to this ideal, but in reality, people tended to concentrate on Greek and Latin. Bodley, however, had studied in Geneva and he did have some Hebrew. So from the start, he acquired Hebrew volumes like this wonderful Anglo-Jewish Psalter with Latin and French glosses, indicating it was probably produced for and certainly studied by Christians. The first keeper or librarian, Thomas James, was required to catalog these books. And we read in a letter Bodley wrote to him how he should make a catalog of all the Hebrew books in the library. This is what James did. And we see here a later copy of the catalog he made. So I will first look at the books collected by one of the greatest scholars England produced in the 17th century, John Selden. John Selden was not a collector of precious books, but his omnivorous and wide-ranging scholarly appetite made him acquire anything he needed. I am not sure he did much care for beautiful manuscripts in themselves, but he made use of beautiful Jewish legal materials, like this magnificent copy of Isaac ben Joseph of Corbeil's legal compendium, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, produced in Italy in the 15th century. I have divided the history of the Bodleian Hebrew and Judaica collections into four periods. The Golden Age, associated with the names of Bodley, Lord, Selden, Pocock, Huntington, Marsh, Marshall, and others, lasting until the beginning of the 18th century. Then the dry period of the 18th century until the French Revolution, where the name of Kennicott shines undisturbed by any competition. Then come the Napoleonic Wars, and in their wake, what I have called the Big Bang, lasting until the middle of the 19th century, which saw the acquisition of some of the largest and most important collections, Canonici, Oppenheimer, and Michael. Mid-century saw a slowdown in the number of acquisitions, although they continued at a slower pace, like this wonderful Spanish liturgical Bible, the 17th century prayer book for the high holidays, the Mahzor, produced in Algiers, or another Mahzor, produced in late medieval times in Catalonia, probably. Other beautiful late medieval productions are the Siddur or prayer book, according to the rite of Carpentras, and probably produced in Provence, and this exquisite Hispano-Portuguese Psalter. All these items were acquired in the middle of the 19th century, and we could go on for hours. And in fact, I can't resist adding a couple more, both belonging to the Reggio collection, a small collection belonging to an Italian rabbi, which was acquired by us in the middle of the 19th century, and which includes this compendium of legal decisions by Asher ben Yechiel de Roche, and another festival prayer book, the Mahzor, which is extremely early, produced in the late 13th or early 14th century, and where you see a scene depicting the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. Some of these books have their original bindings, but like the one we're seeing, some were unfortunately rebound. After the middle of the 19th century, the appointment of Adolf Neubauer as Hebrew curator and his production of the manuscript catalog, which we still use today, of course, together with Malachi Beit Aryeh's superb supplement, makes it possible to locate all the manuscripts in the collection at the time. Together with these, Neubauer bought the Geniza collection, which, although not as large as that of other libraries, including the other plays, does not lag behind any of them in the quality of its holdings. Going back to the 1260s, Archbishop William Laud was the first great supporter of the library. His acquisition of books in many fields, including Hebrew, and his creation of chairs for the learning of Oriental languages, again including Hebrew, were part of a complex political and ecclesiastical program which was interrupted by the Civil War and Laud's execution. Nevertheless, Giles Mandelbrot has ably traced the contours of his Hebrew collecting in our volume, and so I will limit myself to showing some of the interesting donations he made, starting with a book of magic, which had belonged to the Elizabethan astronomer and astrologer John Dee. Two of the greatest of Laud's Hebrew donations are this beautiful illuminated copy of the Hebrew translation of by Samuel Ibn Tibbons of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, produced in Spain in the middle of the 14th century. The second treasure, and our largest Hebrew manuscript, is the Laud Mahzor, or Festival Prayer Book. Observe at the top the hunting scene, where the hunters do not have human heads, as well as the following illumination for a piyut, or liturgical hymn, for Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat before Purim, where you can see the scribe, again with a not quite human face, wearing a Jewish hat. Or the magnificent illumination for the festival of Shavuot, where a faceless angel gives the Torah to the people of Israel. The people of Israel are portrayed as having bird heads, but they're wearing Jewish hats. Whilst further down, Aaron sprinkles the blood of the sacrifice over the people, who originally were faceless. I mean, the eyes, noses, and mouths were added later. So this is a taste of Laud's contribution. The next collection I'm turning our attention to was Pocock's. Edward Pocock was one of the greatest Arabists of his time. He was Laudian Professor of Arabic. He was also Regius Professor of Hebrew. And his work on Judeo-Arabic works of biblical commentary and legal materials has been looked at in detail by Ben Williams, who has given a full and splendid account of Pocock's collection in his chapter. He procured, through Robert Huntington, of whom more later, who was Anglican chaplain of the Levant Company station in Aleppo, and through other agents, works in Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew, and many in Judeo-Arabic, his particular interest, that is, Arabic written in Hebrew letters. They include part of Maimonides' own copy of his commentary on the Mishnah, annotated by the author himself. Pocock made very good use of what he found there. You can see this in his commentary on Joel, where he copies Maimonides' diagram of the Second Temple. He can also, on a different note, I can't resist showing one of his Arabic manuscripts on the Kitab Kalila wa Dimna, the book of animal fables in Arabic, which Pocock acquired. The next great name of the Golden Age that we managed to deal with in detail in our volume is Robert Huntington. He was, as I just said, Anglican chaplain of the Levant Company station in Aleppo. And thanks to Simon Mills and his deep knowledge of Huntington, we have now a good idea of how he acquired his books and what his interests were. We could start with this magnificent 14th century Pentateuch, including both Masoreas and intricate micrography. But the piece de resistance is Maimonides' autograph authorization of his copy of the Code of Law. The red was added digitally, I hasten to add. The last Huntington item I will show is a curiosity. It's a Hebrew transcription of the text of the Quran, and it's decorated to imitate the Arabic originals copies. This is probably unique. I have never seen anything like this, and it's just a curiosity, though. It would not have been collected but for Huntington's appetite for Judeo-Arabic manuscripts. We will now jump to the 18th century, in the middle of the lull in Judaic studies that affected Oxford at the time. And we can see now Benjamin Kennicott, who shines in this period. His incredible scholarly project, the colossal European undertaking, has been examined by Theo Dunkelgrün with his sweeping erudition in his chapter in our volume and elsewhere. And he includes a description of the manuscripts and an exhaustive review of their afterlives and their place in Kennicott's scheme. Kennicott's well-funded project allowed him to acquire a small but select number of manuscripts, starting with the jewel in the Bodleian's Hebrew collection, the Kennicott Bible, here photographed to show off its rare box binding. The book is a masterpiece of Hebrew manuscript production in Iberia. It was made less than 20 years before the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, so it's a sort of swan song. I cannot resist showing the colophon of the artist, Joseph Ibn Chaim. The carpet pages, which in their intricate micrography include one of the Psalms, and it's just a masterpiece. I have to stop here because otherwise it would take all of 2 hours to look at what's needed in the Kennicott Bible. Many people know about it, but few know of the other manuscripts in Kennicott's collection. I will just show quickly the second Kennicott Bible, produced in Castile at the beginning of the 14th century. And at the bottom, you can see the coats of arms of the Kingdom of Castile and Leon. The third Kennicott Bible, which you're looking at now, and just using the same terminology, is a wonderful Ashkenazi liturgical Bible, produced at the end of the 13th century, so again, very early, but fully illuminated. The Kennicott collection is rich in information about the provenance of its constituents, and Theo Dunkelgrün has made full use of this information. I'll show you the Kennicott's own description of the provenance of Kennicott 7. Now, to leave the 18th century, I go to the most colorful figure in the group of collectors we have looked at in the volume, This is Matteo Luigi Canonici, doubtless a very interesting personality. He was a Jesuit priest. He was a collector of coins, medals, books, and paintings. And after the dissolution of his order, he became a dealer, basically. His collecting methods and his misadventures with Venetian law enforcement are reconstructed by Dorit Rains in her chapter, where she also looks in depth at the destiny of the collection after Canonici's death and its arrival at Oxford in 1817. You're looking at a copy of Jacob Ben Asher's Arba Turim, the Code of Law, lavishly decorated in Italy in the 1430s. At the top, you can see a Jewish wedding with the chuppah or canopy. In the section dealing with marriage and divorce, among other topics. In that same section, the subsection dedicated to matrimony and divorce, you can see a wonderful depiction of God. I'll go to the detail. God in the shape of an angel, rather, so represented by an angel, I should say, creating Eve from Adam's rib. There is a very Italianate Garden of Eden in the background and a naked Eve next to a human-faced snake on your right. So we're far from the world of north of the Alps. Another interesting illustration is a court scene where the woman's face at the center has been erased. This is at the top. At the bottom, the figure remains untouched. If we take a closer look, we can see that this is the traditional depiction of Justitia, of justice, who's holding a sword in her right hand and the scales on her left hand. So this is some of the materials that you can see in this lavishly illustrated book. And as Judith Olszewicz-Langer explained to me, this apparently follows the fashion in Italy at the time, in late medieval times, for illuminating the codices, the legal codices that were produced, especially at the University of Bologna. I now go to a liturgical Bible, and I promise this is the last jewel I look at. Well, not quite, but almost. It was produced in 1472, and we're in a different world here. We have Adam and Eve wearing no clothes, and as Piet van Boxel, my predecessor, pointed out, the damsel with the unicorn resting its head on her lap corresponds to traditional depictions of the Virgin Mary. So this is the Jewish commissioned and Jewish-owned manuscript of the Bible. And so Italian Jewry was a different world in all senses. There's last a copy of a much more popular type of illumination. This is for the Meshalakat Moni, a book of fables produced in the Middle Ages by Isaac ibn Sahula in Spain. But the copy we're looking at is actually from Ashkenaz. Now we come to the largest of the collections, which constitute the Hebrew funds in the Bodleian Library. This is David Oppenheim's collection. The result of a lifetime collecting, no expense spared. David Oppenheim's collecting program is examined in detail in this chapter by Joshua Teplitsky, who knows more about the man than anyone alive. For the vision behind his collecting activities, please also see Joshua Teplitsky's book about him. As you can see, he identified with King David, who figures in the title pages he added to many of the codices and printed books he bought. he commissioned or was given. The only thing, I'm mindful of the time, the only thing I want to show you about this collection is this wonderful depiction of the Akedah, Isaac's sacrifice, in this copy of the Pentateuch with the Aramaic translation, Onkelos, and Rashi's commentary on the right. It was produced in 1340. Once again, it's with regret that I leave the Oppenheim collection. And we come to the Michael collection, the second largest manuscript collection in the Hebrew section. It was amassed by a German scholar, Heimann Michael, at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was acquired by the Bodleian after his death in the middle of the century. The story of Heimann Michael and his collection is dealt with by Saverio Campanini in his chapter in our volume, and where his deep learning has been put to good use in what is up to now very much an unexplored field. The collection is particularly rich in liturgical items, and what you're seeing is the so-called Michael Machzor. It's a prayer book for the festivals. You see again a hunting scene, but the hunters and the hunted are upside down, and this probably means the volume was illuminated by Christian artists who did not understand that Hebrew is written from right to left and probably started the book backwards. In this case, in the case of who illuminated the volume, there is no doubt in the case of the tripartite Machzor, whose other two parts are held in Budapest and at the British Library, and which has been shown by Sarit Shaleveini of the Hebrew University to have been illuminated in a workshop by Lake Constance in the German-Swiss border. We can see here the typically medieval illumination, and here again, the illumination for the initial word of Kol Nidre, the part of the liturgy for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Michael collection also contains more recent and more naive illuminations. For example, this illumination, which is part of the Sefer Evronot, that is a book of calendrical calculations, and it was produced again in the German lands, and it depicts, as you can see, for the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. So that's kind of become a theme, I think, in this talk for some reason, not at all intended. Now there is a long story attached to this manuscript, Kabbalistic volume, which was the Sefer HaPeliah. This manuscript is unique in that it was produced by a Jew who converted to Christianity. It was produced in Italy for a Christian who had commissioned it and who clearly intended to study it. For more about the story of this fascinating manuscript, please consult Professor Campanini's chapter. It's a long and very interesting story. Now, it is very common in the world of scribal practice and book production in the last centuries in early modern times to use old parchment, reuse old parchment to repair printed books and manuscripts. And this was the case usually with many Jewish fragments. This has been explored in the project led by Professors Judith Olshovich Schlanger, Professor Mauro Perani, Emma Abate, Dr. Emma Abate, and many others. And it's now in Oxford, taking place in Oxford as well. And what we have here is an example of the opposite situation. Rather than use or reuse a discarded piece of a Jewish manuscript, we have here a disused or recycled piece of a Christian literary production. This is Chrétien de Troyes Poèmes Cligés. It was used to repair one of the Michal collection manuscripts. It just shows all the things that can be found if the books are examined carefully, as the members of the project have been doing for years now. The great coup of Neubauer, as mentioned above, was the acquisition of the Cairo Geniza fragments. The story of the acquisition, with its ins and outs, and the competition, the fierce competition between Schechter in Cambridge, Neubauer in Oxford, and others later for getting hold of as many manuscripts, manuscript remnants as possible from the Cairo Geniza, the depot where books were kept, disused and destroyed books were kept. It's a fascinating story. Once again, I'm looking at time and I won't have enough to talk about it. So I refer you to Nadia Vidro's chapter in our book. She does a wonderful job of telling the story of what happened and how the fragments came to come to Oxford, to the Bodleian. You're looking at a fragment of the book of Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus, whose existence was doubted by some scholars, and which was, this question was only solved with the apparition, so to speak, of this manuscript amongst the Geniza fragments. And we are fortunate in Oxford to hold several pages of this manuscript, as does Cambridge. Last but not least, from the Geniza, first I'll show you a manuscript. This is the oldest dated fragment of the Talmud, and it is also found in the Geniza. This is uniquely important because due to the destruction, the massive destruction campaign of the Talmud in Europe, very few early copies survived. Just one complete copy, for that matter, held at Munich. So this makes this into a very important find. But I come last, but not least, to our copy of Maimonides' own autograph of the draft of a section of the Mishneh Torah, with his marginal annotations and his deletions and additions. This is indeed one of the most valuable manuscripts we have. And as Piet van Boxel has said, we own a whole choir of these manuscripts. So to call our collection of Geniza fragments is a misnomer. In many cases, we hold substantial parts of works. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to leave the Bodleian, and we'll have a brief tour, a very brief tour of the Oxford colleges. They have been studied in depth by Rachel Fronda in her chapter, which goes into length at the treasures found in the colleges, which are unique and which very few people know about, because in some cases they have never been properly catalogued. Work for which Rachel is doing her best to remedy the situation. She has looked at Merton College. You can see here the fragment of one of the stars or legal documents that they own. She's looked at Christ Church, which she knows particularly well. This is a detail of the star, sorry, the Merton College star, where you can see the Hebrew at the bottom. Christ Church holds, for example, this beautiful copy of the Psalter. It's a Latin Psalter, but it has a Hebrew translation, and not just the Hebrew translation, you're looking at a detail now, but a word-for-word interlinear translation of the Hebrew into Latin. So clearly this was used for by Christians, presumably, to study the Hebrew Bible, or God knows, but certainly the Latin hand is Christian. Now, Rachel also has looked at Lincoln College, and there we meet one of the people whose collections also went to the Bodleian. In fact, the Bodleian had first choice of this man's collection. This is Lincoln rector Thomas Marshall. And we have many of Marshall's books and manuscripts, but Lincoln College holds some as well. And they are extremely interesting, as again, Rachel shows in her article, so please look at it. She also looks at Bodleian and Exeter. So in a sense, this is just a minority of colleges, and there is a world out of there which needs exploring. Now, it is fitting that I end, oh dear, yes, I must end. So it is fitting that I end with a Christian Hebraist, as it was the work of Christian Hebraists to which the Bodleian and Oxford colleges owed their initial preeminence in the field. They were, of course, later joined by Jewish scholars and collectors who enriched it very, very much. But it was only the agenda, let's say, of Christian Hebraists in the late 16th and 17th centuries that gave Oxford the advantage, that gave it its flying star. So there we must end. I thank again my co-editor, my co-contributors, Bodleian publishing staff, the Bodley's librarian and the head of Oriental, but Martin Gross, again, for his encouragement and for his financial support. My predecessors and all of Bodleian's librarians, down to Richard Dovenden, in our time, have made this possible by acquiring these priceless collections. So it has been a most enjoyable trip, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cesar, for that wonderful overview to display to us the wealth of the collections, which I think were unknown to many of us, and certainly to me. And indeed, it was a particular pleasure to see the Merton manuscript. My college is Merton. And I just wanted to say, before we start the questions, that Cesar's co-editor is Rebecca Abrams, not Rebecca Adams, as I mistakenly said. My elderly eyes are letting me down, but it's important to put that right, because we owe a great debt to both editors for bringing together such a magnificent volume for us. So I think we'd like to take some questions now. If anyone would like to ask the question themselves, please do at this stage. Richard Parford will let you in. If anyone would like me to read some of the questions we have on the chat, I'm happy to do that. Well, perhaps I'll read one of the questions just to get us started. And we have a question from Rebecca Abrams, where she asks that we know that Jews living in England in the 12th and 13th century not only read and owned books, but in several cases, including David of Oxford, had valued and valuable private libraries of Hebrew books. And she wonders if we know what happened to these texts after the 1290 expulsion. Did they all leave the country with their owners, and have any of them found their way back into the Bodleians' collections?
Well, the short answer is we do not really know what happened to the books. We presume most of them must have left with their owners. However, there are cases like the wonderful Hebrew manuscript at Corpus Christi with the annotation by the owner, who was a Spanish Jew and writes in Judeo-Arabic in it. So this has stayed here. And there are quite a few of our books which in our collections, in the collections that were established by Bodleian and that arrived in the 17th century, that look like Hebrew manuscripts who never left England. The problem is that, as far as I know, there is no inscription or information on any of these volumes which might identify its owner as Anglo-Jewish. So we just don't know, is the short answer.
We have a question from Jane Ball. She asks, can you tell us a little more about the destruction of the Talmud you mentioned?
Oh dear, that is a very interesting question, but it would keep us here for ages. There were, in fact, several destructions of the Talmud, and the one in Paris in particular is infamous because the descriptions are of cartloads of copies being taken to the bonfire. So all I can say is that out of what must have been hundreds of copies of the Talmud current in Europe at the time, we only have one complete copy left, the Munich copy. So this is an indication of how thorough the destruction was. But I can't go into it any further, and I'm not a specialist on this at all. So, but that's all I can say.
We have a question from Sharon Fleming asking, do you know why the face of justice was removed?
I do not. I have heard from art historians conjectures as to why. The straight answer might be that this was a pagan goddess, the goddess of justice, and it probably was felt that it was not a good thing to have. On the other hand, this is an Italian manuscript, and you get things which to the more, let's say, uptight northern co-religionists would be totally unacceptable. So I'm just not sure about it.
We had a similar question about the presence of the unicorn, which people were puzzled by. Why does the unicorn?
I heard a very good explanation. I think it was from Sarit Shaleveini. It was in our last manuscripts workshop. And it had to do with the fact that the book can be traced to Ferrara, the illumination school and everything. And one of the explanations was that the unicorn was one of the symbols of the Este family, the ruling family in Ferrara. And that would have been the context in which the owners would have seen it. So that explains it. Let's put it that way. It wasn't put there just because.
I see. Yes. Yes. Would anyone like to ask their questions themselves? Because that is now possible if you would like. We have one or two more, if not. Israel Tuman is asking, could we please have some more account of how the libraries came to acquire the collections? Is there something more you might say there, Cesar?
Yes, I could quickly say that you can see two patterns. The 17th century, it was mostly English, literally English. There were no Scottish, Welsh, or Irish collectors per se. They were all Christian Hebraists or Anglican clergymen. Mm. And their personal collections were either given to the Bodleian or they were bought from their heirs after their death. That's how the core of the collection came about. In the first half of the 19th century, it was a different story. I think following the upheaval in Europe, following the Napoleonic Wars, people needed cash, and this led to the acquisition of the Canonici collection. Then Oppenheim, it's clear that they looked for buyers in the German lands, and nobody, Jewish or non-Jewish, could come up with the cash. And then the Michael collection, the Michael collection, was exactly the same. So this has been practiced, and it has continued to our days of buying collections where possible. The last example being our Geniza collection, the Lewis Gibson collection, which was bought jointly with Cambridge.
At Cambridge, yeah. Sure. We have a question from Emily Rose asking, are there examples of Hebrew readers learning Latin or just Latin readers learning Hebrew?
I know very little about this, but yes, of course, in our collections, it's Latin readers learning Hebrew mostly, but there are cases of Jews learning Hebrew, and we have very, very few, but we have examples. And I know that elsewhere it's being attested. So contrary to the general impression or opinion, quite a few Jews must have learned Latin in the course of the centuries.
Yes, okay. We have a very interesting question here about, do we know whether the artwork in the books was done by Jews or by Christians, bearing in mind the biblical prohibition on images?
Clearly, the biblical prohibition of images has been interpreted in very different ways, both in Christian and Jewish cultures and throughout the times and in different places. In the material I showed, it was quite clear that north of the Alps, in Ashkenazi areas, after a certain point in the Middle Ages, the depiction of the human face was frowned upon. You can see that the Spanish world and the Italian world were not at all of the same the same mind. So anyway, this is a very good question, but a complicated one which I would not have time to answer and do not have the expertise even more to answer here.
We have a question from Rosie asking, do any of the collections contain Samaritan manuscripts, for example, the Samaritan Pentateuch?
Yes, we do. The only reason we have not included them is that we wanted, and this was a purely, shall we say, pragmatic reason. We wanted things written in the modern square Jewish alphabet, not the ancient Samaritan script. But I can tell you that there are dozens of manuscripts and scrolls. Huntington and other agents buying in the Middle East bought not just Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew, they bought also Arabic and Hebrew manuscripts from Samaritans, and we have many. We just, unfortunately, we just haven't been able to deal with these collections.
A few people are asking about the general availability of these. Can the public see them and so on? And some are asking about whether this would be a nice collection for an exhibition.
Indeed it would. Indeed it would. We wanted to get away. I'm sorry if my talk gave the completely opposite impression, but we wanted to get away from the masterpiece approach and from concentrating on highlights. We wanted a global approach to the collections. The subject is so complicated that I couldn't deal with it adequately in this talk, which is why I chose the easy way out. But it is indeed a very good idea.
Well, I think we're coming close to the end of our time. We have to wrap up. So I think I'm sure if there are any further questions, you can send them to us on email, and we try to answer them. But on behalf of everyone, I would just like to thank Cesar for giving us a really wonderful introduction to these holdings that are unknown to so many of us, and for demonstrating the sheer richness of the Jewish heritage, and particularly the collections here in Oxford. And I think we also, again, as I say, pay tribute to the editors of the volume and all those who contributed to the volume, because I think many of the questions that are being asked on the chat are probably being answered very fully in that volume as well. So I say yes. So if I could then wrap up and say thank you so much indeed once again for taking us through all that. And I think it whets our appetite for possibly a future exhibition, if you can stand it. At some future stage, but
yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.